Income Tax 2020 Practice Problem Number 1, Part 1, Data Input Form W-2 or W-2 Forms. Come in, relax with Income Tax 2020. Here we are in our Lacerte tax software. You don't need the Lacerte tax software to follow along, although I do believe they have a 30-day free trial. So if you can get access to the promo version or a demo version of the software, it could be a good tool to practice with. We're going to be doing the data input into the system here. If you don't have access to a software, you can find the forms at the IRS website at irs.gov, irs.gov, and populate those forms such as the 1040 with a PDF file, or simply print them out and fill out the forms and follow along there. We are going to use the data input in the software because that'll make it a little bit faster. If you have other software that you can practice with, then you can use other software to work along with as well. We will be entering the data in a couple different formats. One, we're going to be putting it into the forms and the software, and then two, and this will be in a future presentation, we'll put it into an Excel worksheet and we'll provide you access to the Excel worksheet as well, so we can think about it in terms of a formula basis and double check our work as we then do the data input. In a prior presentation, we took a look at all of our information that's going to be in this file. If you don't have access to this file, that's okay, because we'll put it on the screen here as well. But if you have this information, you can open it all up and kind of practice data inputting it and possibly using this as a double check of it. And then if we go into this, we opened up all the forms here, and now we have this open, and we're going to have our data input here. And then we're going to use then our data input screens going back and forth to input into the software. Now, if you had two monitors to do this from the screen, that would be really nice. Otherwise, you might still want to print this information out and list it on your desk. Notice we have this in order now in terms of the order that we think would be the easiest to put this information into the system. We had used the information for the W-2 to populate the starting point in a prior presentation. This would come from both the W-2 and or the prior tax return, that we would have, okay, what's their status in terms of their filing status. We're going to say married, filing jointly. We have Eric Smith, Jane Smith, the husband and spouse. We then have the social security numbers for both, which could be found on the W-2s if they're not on the prior tax return for whatever reason, if you don't have access to it. And then we have the address, which once again would be found on the W-2s or pretty much any other documentation such as a 1099. That's where our main starting point will be. And now we're going to go ahead and start to populate. And the first form to use for most people that are in their working years would be the W-2 type forms. So I'm going to put that into the data input now, and we'll come back over here and see what the impact will be on the 1040 as we go. So if you're just filling out the 1040, you can see the input there, and you can see some of the other boxes, and you might ask, well, why are we populating those other boxes when they're not having an impact on the 1040? I'll try to kind of explain that too as we go. So if I go back on over, and we're going to go to the data input, and we're going to put the employee information. I'm going to pull up the W-2 then. Our W-2 is going to look like this. This is obviously kind of a mock W-2 that we made in Excel, but it has the primary boxes that will be relevant to us for the data input. The W-2 will look something like this. This is the 2020 W-2, but it'll look, or 2021, but it'll look something like this. So we've kind of mocked up this in Excel because they won't let us populate a PDF file in the actual form that you would download from the IRS. But just note that if you have any questions about anything in the box for a W-2 form, you can download the W-2 form and then scroll down to the instructions related to it, and you'll have basically box by box instructions down here. And then those can help you to populate if you got any questions, such as box 12, often being kind of one of those confusing boxes if it's going to be populated. So here's going to be our information. First, we're going to need to determine who the employer is and which spouse that we're going to be dealing with. So if I go back on over here, note that if I go back to the client information, the way that most software, at least this software, will be set up is the first input, the first person you put into the tax return will be the taxpayer, typically the husband traditionally, and then the second one would be the spouse. So that means that any other data input we put in will typically be applied to the taxpayer and then spouse. Now, you might think that this shouldn't make a difference due to the fact that they're married now, so they're like one taxable entity. And isn't that what kind of happens when you get married? They're just like one taxable entity. That is the case for the most part. But there could be some types of things that we need to tell the software so it can give us some advice. For example, Sometimes if like there's an ability to put money into like an IRA, then I need to know whether or not the wages have been applied to one spouse or the other possibly, and whether or not they have access to another retirement plan possibly. And I need to then allocate the W-2s to the proper spouse to do that. So whatever system you have in your data input, that could be necessary. It might not always be necessary depending on the needs of the return, but it's good practice to do that if you're putting it into like tax software. So I'm going to say the first item is going to be employer 1. So this is employer 1. It's going to populate for us here because I've input that employer before. I do have a different EIN number, so I'm going to change the EIN number to the 55. So I'm going to say, all right, this is 555, 55, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I'll say that, and then, so there we have that. Now, the information that you need to give to the IRS for is going to include more than just what it has in the past. They want more and more information. So you need the EIN number, and we have that. If there's a state ID number, you got to pick that up, and then we have the address down below. Remember that as we enter the W-2s, this is going to be information that also will be going to the IRS. So if you ever get any questions from the client that says, hey, look, I think the W-2 was wrong in any way, shape, or form, then it may well be wrong, but just note that the IRS has it. So at this point in time, we're kind of locked into either putting the data that's on the W-2 into the tax return, or else if we do not, the IRS will almost surely, match it up to what they have in their system, because they can do that with an automated system and then ask questions about it, and we'll have to deal with it in the future. So if there's a problem on the W-2 form, note that you really need to go to the employer to go through an amendment process of the W-2 to really kind of fix that problem. Because if we try to fix it on the tax return side, it's just going to delay the problem because we're going to get a question about it in the future. So that's a good to just basically keep in mind in case there is kind of an issue, and we have to say, hey, look, if there's a problem with the W-2, that's the employee. We got to go to the employer and see if they can amend that problem. So in any case, then we've got the 50,000 here. So I'm going to say 50,000 on the income. So I'm going to go back on over, and this is for the husband, the taxpayer. So I'm not going to check anything off here. That's how this software works. The default will be to the primary taxpayer, typically the husband. We're going to put 50,000 into the wages. So that then populated the Social Security and Medicare wages and the Social Security and Medicare taxes on its own. Now these taxes, because they're more of a flat tax, that's why it kind of has the capability to be able to at least guess that. Notice what it did not guess is the federal income tax, because it doesn't have the capability basically to do that, because that's a progressive tax system. It's too complex. So I'm going to populate the federal income tax, is going to be the 5,000. Now it was wrong on this 50,000. That's not what we have over here. It should be the 60,000 for the Social Security. The reason box 1 and box 3 might be different is because of something like a 401k plan or something like that. And so if there's a difference here, you would expect then to see something in, say, box 12 related to a cafeteria plan or a 401k plan, something that would be taxable for Social Security and Medicare possibly, but not for the wages for federal income taxes. So that's what that difference will typically be. And I'm going to say, okay, so that means that this one, I need to change this to 60,000. And then it correctly populates that. And it's also now calculating the Medicare tax. So if I then say, and the Social Security. So now if I have the correct wages, 60,000, Medicare is basically a flat tax, 0.062. So it calculates that 3,720. That should be correct. 60,000 for Medicare times 0.0145, 870, then those two amounts should basically be correct. So if I go back on over, we're going to say that we had Social Security and Medicare are populated by the software correctly. Now, when you then pull this over to the actual tax forms, this number and this number are the ones that you're primarily going to be concerned with, because the Social Security and Medicare, if all you have is W-2 wages, should have been calculated correctly by the employer. So these two things should have already been paid properly, and we're just kind of double checking them and then recording if there's any kind of problem, like they hit the cap and they overput money into it or something like that. That's why these two seem like they're irrelevant a lot of the times. If you do a lot of tax returns, you're like, there's no effect on the Social Security and Medicare and the amount that was with, why do I have to put that in to the system? Well, there could be an effect sometimes because it's basically, they're just basically double checking, but these two should have already been paid because they're simple tax. They're more of a flatter tax. So we should just have informational purposes here. And then if there's a problem with these two, or if we have Social Security and Medicare for self-employment tax or something like that, or if they hit the cap and there's the overpayment, then we can reconcile those problems on the tax return. Hopefully there aren't any, and usually they're not. And so these are more informational kind of content. So then if I go back on over, that $10,000 difference then was down here in box 12, and that was, I'm going to say it was a 401k plan. So we're going to say this is a 401k plan. That's indicated by box 12, a D within it. So that box 12 will typically be accompanied by some letter. And then if you don't know what the letter is, you can go to the instructions. If they're not provided to you with the documentation you got in your PDF file, you can go to the IRS website, look it up, look up the form instructions, and look up the D, which will typically be that retirement plan. So obviously if we went back over to our instructions, we've got box 12 and we're looking at 12D, electronic deferrals for a section 401k plan, we're going to say. Okay, so that's going to be the primary information there. Also note that we said they do have a retirement plan, so we got to make sure that I check that off here. So I should be checking that off. And that's actually really important whether or not they put money into the retirement plan, because the last thing that you do on the tax planning, as we'll talk later in the adjustments to income, is often whether or not they could put money into an IRA. And that will be dependent in part as to whether they have access to a 401k plan. So if they have access to a 401k plan, that might limit their ability to put money into an IRA, and you want to make sure to check that off so that you can ask them that last question. If they can put money into a retirement plan, then and they're not using it or they're not maxing it out, then you can also give them some advice on maxing it out. You can't max out a 401k plan after the year end when you actually do the tax return, even though you can ask them if they are eligible to put money into an IRA up until the point in time, if they're eligible, to the time you do the taxes, which would be like April 15th. So that's like the last thing you can kind of check in on. But you can, with the 401k plan, recommend that they put more money into the 401k plan if that's going to be applicable, just to give some tax planning, just some added value as you do the data input. So what we have thus far then, if I go back on over here, I'm going to say, all right, so far we got line 1. So if you're just putting this directly into like the 1040, you'd have the 50,000 that's coming from line. Oh, there's one more piece of information. Sorry about that. And that's the state. Like if there is state taxes, I think we had state taxes. And we're not focused on the state as much over here, but just note that we want to just look at it when we get to the state tax deductibility kind of section. So that's going to be $450 for the state. So this would be a withholding for the state. Again, I'm not going to get a lot into the state taxes here because it'll differ from state to state, but just realize that if you're in a state that has state taxes, then you're going to want to input the state information basically at the same time. Okay, so then I'm going to go back on over, and we're going to say that we've got the wages in the 50,000 up top, and then that's going to carry down to our total income, because that's all we have so far. We have no adjustments to income at this point, so we got the 50,000 adjusted gross income. We've got the 24,800 standard deduction at this point because they're married filing joint, and we don't have anything on the itemized deductions thus far. That gives us our taxable income of the 25,200. This is probably your stopping point with regards to basically the income statement. However, you can then check whether the amount that they have withholded so far. So if I go to page 2, in other words, I'm not going to focus in on the tax that has been calculated yet because it doesn't really matter until I do all the data input. But I do want to double check possibly the withholdings. So the withholdings are down here. This is the amount of payments that we made that was withheld from the W-2s. So we can check that kind of as we go in doing the data input process. All right, but mainly we're looking at part 1 most likely to get down to the bottom line, kind of the taxable income, which is kind of like the net income on the income statement side of the tax equation. Okay, so let's do the other one. I'm going to say, all right, so now we've done the data input for this W-2, and we'll do the second W-2. This is going to be the spouse's W-2. So we got to note this is going to be for the spouse, 30,000 spouse. This is going to be employer 1 again. So I'm going to say employer 1, Let's go back on over, and I'm going to say employer 1. So employer 1 with the dot next to it. And this now it's the spouse, so I need to tell them it's a spouse, or else the software won't be able to do some of those allocations, like can they put money into an IRA or something. There's no retirement plan on this one, I'm going to say, because they don't have this item checked off. Now, if she doesn't have access to a retirement plan, then I'm definitely going to kind of think about the IRA. So I'm going to say, I might put into my notes here, spouse IRA contribution, and then taxpayer, can they put more into 401k plan? And so I can ask them about those, basically just for some tax planning to just add value. At the end, tax software will often provide you suggestions like that, depending on the software that you have. They'll give you diagnostics and say, hey, they could have put this much more into the 401k plan. They might want to increase that next year, or, that they could have put money into an IRA and whatnot. But you want to be proactive and kind of think about those as you go. And then we're going to have the 30,000 in the income. So I'm going to say, all right, 30,000 there. And that populates these automatically. And then the federal income tax that was withheld is the 3,000. So the software cannot guess that one because the federal income tax is too complex. But it can guess then the Social Security, which is going to be 30,000 Social Security wages, which is the same this time, times 0.062, 8,000 or 1,860. And then 30,000 times 0.0145, which is the 435. So there we have that. And then let me pick up the state tax, make sure I get that this time. That's going to be the 370. 370, I'm picking that up down here for the state tax, which I'm not going to focus on the state, but just realize that obviously, again, you're going to enter state data at the same time. So then if I go back on over to the W-2 or to the forms, you can see how this form gets a little bit more complicated because we have two things that are going to be involved here. We've got the 80,000 now, so when I double check it, I'm going to have to add up the W-2s. It'll be easier for me to do that if I just do the data input again into a separate software or separate system, in our case, an Excel worksheet. So if I do the separate data input from the data input forms into another Excel worksheet, or somebody else does it even, then we have a better double check and it'll be easier for me to see, as opposed to me lining up all my W-2s again and trying to add up all the box ones and all the box, withholdings and twos and whatnot. We can see then a summary here, if we can double check it kind of this way. Here we have the taxpayer and the spouse with the added information there. So now we're up to the 80,000, which of course is the two W-2s, and we would double check that, and we'll do that in the Excel worksheet, but we'll do it all at once when we do all the income together. And then we've got the 24,800 as the standard deduction. That's going to give us our taxable income of the 55,200. Again, that's kind of where we stop in terms of the income side of things. However, we can check the payment side of things. In other words, if I go back on over here and I was to say, I'm not going to really get into the tax calculation at this point, because I haven't done all the data input, but I can double check what the withholdings are at this point, which is that 8,000, which should tie out to the two withholdings on the W-2s, and we can also check kind of the withholdings on the state tax returns. Now, just remember, if you have a state tax return, then the state should kind of mirror, a lot of times if it's an income stack, the federal system to some degree. So you'll have a similar kind of system with the state information, and you can of course check the withholdings from the state as well on the state tax return as well. So for example, as I enter this federal information, most of the state information is going to be populated in the same kind of point, because California, in this case, will mirror the Fed to some degree with it. So that's where we will stop now, and we might do some of the data input into the Excel worksheet in future presentations, and then continue on to some of the more of the income items.